Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, music lovers and audiophiles. Today we'll be reviewing the PSI Audio AVAA C214 active bass traps. I hope you enjoy it. Room treatments in general, and bass traps specifically, are probably not the sexiest products in the audio pantheon. At least until you hear them. And even when you do hear them, it's quite possible that you don't fully hear what they can do. Not through any fault of the treatments, but because bass traps generally have to be used in significant numbers or large sizes to be effective. Such installations are expensive and visually impactful, unless perhaps you use active bass traps like the PSI Audio AVAA under review here. Let's talk about the problem we're trying to solve. We should back up a bit to invite everyone watching into the discussion. Your stereo system is set up in a room, and in all homes, that room will have walls and a ceiling and a floor. There will be dimensions between those walls, where you might find that the front and rear walls are, let's say, 20 feet apart, and the side walls are 15 feet apart from each other, and maybe the ceiling is 9 feet from the floor. Those dimensions support resonances, frequency bands where the sound is emphasized. A room that is 20 feet long will have a primary axial resonance at 28 Hertz. And it will have resonances around the major multiples of that number: 56 Hertz, 84 Hertz, 112 Hertz, and so on. It will also have resonances caused by the width. So in our example, you would find resonances at 37 Hertz, 74 Hertz, 111 Hertz, and so on. And the floor to ceiling dimension, of course, you're probably getting the idea by now, would set up resonances at 62 Hertz, 124 Hertz, 186 Hertz, etc. These are just the axial modes because they're the simplest and generally the most obvious. Why do we care? Well, we care because those resonances or modes will tend to show up as bass peaks in your room. And where you don't have modes, you will sometimes have frequency response dips. These are more or less permanent features of your room. Sure, you can design a room to reduce the problem by improved spacing of the resonances, but you will still have resonances. You can also place your speakers in your listening position to smooth out the results somewhat. This is a complex subject, and we'll have some future videos addressing pieces of it. But trust me, it's complicated. If you want to calculate the axial resonance modes in your room, you can do that easily with a calculator on your phone and a tape measure. You'll have primary resonances at 1,125 divided by 2 times the dimension of your room in feet. You use that formula to calculate the resonance for each major dimension, length, width, and height. This will give you the resonant frequencies measured in Hertz. You'll also have resonances at 2 times each of those frequencies, and 3 times, and 4 times, etc. These formulas work the best with simple rectangular rooms. You know, if you think of how a bedroom is often set up, it's 4 walls with 90-degree corners and a flat ceiling and a flat floor. So we have a series of resonances that tend to lead to bumps in frequency response. We should also note that since the room modes are resonant frequencies, there's likely to be a timing issue in that the modes will ring or display overhang, defined as the modal frequencies continuing to make sound for some number of milliseconds longer than desired. That could be 100 milliseconds, which is a tenth of a second, or more, and you can hear that. We can address the peaks and the overhang by using bass absorbers, often called bass traps. Or you could use DSP, which we won't be addressing here. Bass absorbers are generally boxes or tubes with absorptive material or diaphragms sized to absorb bass, which means they're relatively large. They're often placed in corners because the corner is a high pressure zone for all the axial modes. Ideally, The absorbers would be tuned to the modal frequencies you face, but practically, they're often designed to absorb a broad range of bass frequencies because they're built for consumers and the manufacturer doesn't know exactly where those modal frequencies are. Bass problems, especially below 100 to 200 hertz, are some of the bigger problems in high-end audio. If bass absorbers were a foolproof solution, I suppose this wouldn't be the case, but bass absorbers face problems. You have to know where you need them, you have to know that you need them, you have to know how to use them, and you have to pay for them. You also have to have enough of them. Let's talk about the PSI Audio AVAA C214. The last issue I mentioned, having enough bass traps, leads to another issue, and that's one with visual impact. Which is to say, you might need 8 or 12 traps or more, and these might be 3 feet by 16-inch columns or 2 foot by 2 foot by 18-inch triangular boxes each. In a smaller room, there may be the simple issue of where to place these. Do you have enough room for them? In a larger room, you'll probably need more traps, and in any event, they will be quite visible. That's fine in a dedicated room, but in a regular living room that you share with other people and other uses besides listening to audio, it may be a non-starter. That's where the PSI Audio AVAA bass traps come in. PSI Audio is a Swiss pro audio company, and the AVAA was developed for use in recording studios, but it's now available for consumer use in the US. The AVAA is an active bass trap. You probably heard me emphasize that at the beginning. That means that instead of just using absorptive material like wool or foam or a diaphragm, the AVAA has drivers in a column that are driven by an internal amplifier. The AVAA column has a microphone in it which listens to the bass in the room and feeds an out-of-phase signal to the AVAA amp and drivers to cancel some of the bass that reaches the AVAA. The key point is that the AVAA should be able to control more modal bass per unit volume than passive bass traps can. And as a result, it should get the job done in rooms where large arrays of bass traps are impractical. The active aspect of the AVAA also makes it somewhat adjustable. Okay, that technology is cool maybe, or sort of cool, but let's talk about whether it works. I was supplied with 2 AVAA bass traps. As you can see, these are small columns. They're about 25 inches high and 9 inches in diameter, which makes them pretty easy to place. I had one behind a chair and another adjacent to a floor lamp. They're made of metal and they seem quite solid. They have rubber feet so they don't resonate or rattle around as the drivers are moving. I used the AVAAs in 2 different rooms. In each case, I placed them in the available tri-corners of the room where the walls and floor come together. I set the AVAAs using the PSI app to the reference level, and I listened. My initial impression was that bass was better balanced and somewhat tighter than in the existing setup where I had spent hours dialing in the speakers and the listening location. The difference wasn't dramatic, but it was a meaningful step in the right direction. Most audio progress, by the way, is in this meaningful step category, at least once you have a good basic system. I ran some measurements to see if the changes brought about by the AVAAs were noticeable. Here's a frequency response run from the listening position. Take a look at that. The purple line that you see is the frequency response without AVAAs, and the green line is with AVAAs. You can see that the AVAA has its effect primarily below 200 Hertz. Zooming in on that, we see this. Now we're looking at the purple line, which is without AVAA, and a red line, which is with AVAA. The bass peaks are lowered by 4 to 6 dB, and the dips are lowered too, at least below 100 Hertz. Above 100 Hertz, the AVAA smooths things out slightly. The AVAA results look a little bit like turning down the bass if you had a bass tone control, which you probably don't. But on closer examination, the AVAA is a little different than what a tone control would do, because it does more where the resonances and dips are and not as much in between. And then above 100 Hertz, it seems to work in a different kind of way. I then moved the AVAAs to a different room with different dimensions and different speakers. Here's a frequency response curve measured at the listening position from 20 to 400 Hertz. The green line is without the AVAAs, and the yellow line is with the AVAAs. As before, the peak between 50 and 80 Hertz is reduced, but this time the subsequent dip is also reduced. I don't mean that the level is reduced, but that the dip is less deep and the overall curve is smoother. Some dips are caused by cancellation effects, and if the bass is reduced at those frequencies, the cancellation may be reduced. In this room, I also checked out the spectrogram. Actually, I did it in both rooms, with and without the AVAAs. This is the spectrogram with the AVAAs. Spectrograms are hard to compare because they're complex plots, but when I closely examined the spectrograms, what I saw was that the decay of the bass peaks was reduced in time. Time is the vertical axis on a spectrogram, by 75 to 100 milliseconds. Given that we're looking at T30 decays here of 200 to 250 milliseconds, that's actually fairly substantial. Of course, part of that is due simply to reducing the levels. Listening to a wide variety of music with special emphasis on bass test tracks, I again felt that the AVAAs made an immediately noticeable difference. The more important point was that the difference was always an improvement. With the AVAAs, bass was better balanced and more natural. This naturalness shows up with bass sounding more open, more detailed, and more accurate, with a sense of better air and harmonic definition. I should also characterize the magnitude of the improvement wrought by the AVAAs. First of all, the bass isn't suddenly rendered perfect. The general shape of the frequency response, with the existence of peaks and dips, isn't transformed. But the improvement is bigger than what you might hear with, say, two different good power amplifiers. That's a rough comparison because the AVAA does all its work at low frequencies, and amplifiers can affect the full frequency spectrum. But amplifiers generally make easily identifiable differences. You often hear them in the bass, and those differences can be important to accuracy. So does the AVAA, but it doesn't just make changes or differences. It does something that appears beneficial in almost every system I can imagine that doesn't already have bass traps. It's also outside of the basic circuit from source to speaker, so you can get the AVAA benefits without sacrificing any of the hard-earned goodness that you've dialed into the rest of your stereo. Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. As you may know, I'm Tom Martin, Chief Content Officer of The Absolute Sound. We have a new product. It's on the Substack platform, and we're going to do some interesting things with Substack. First of which is reader questions and answers. Each Monday, readers will submit questions. We'll pick the most interesting ones and we'll answer the questions on Friday. We'll also have early access to articles and special blogs that don't appear anywhere else. We hope you'll join us. It's only a cost of a cup of coffee per month. Just check on the screen or in the show notes below. Thanks, and now back to the show. Let's discuss usability and value. The AVAAs cost $39.50 each in the US. Note that you can use a single AVAA. There's no reason you have to use two of them, but even then the price is non-trivial for many listeners. On the other hand, you could easily spend a lot more changing speakers or amplifiers or DACs or even wiring looms. To assess value relative to passive traps, because I really think you've got to have some kind of bass traps if you're serious about getting your system right, I compared the AVAA to standard bass traps. I got this frequency response curve. I used 4 passive bass traps for the green line and just 2 AVAAs for the yellow line. If this measurement is representative, it would appear that the passive traps do more of their work above 100 Hz, and the AVAAs are more effective below 100 Hz. Now note, I was using normal consumer-sized bass traps. There are giant or custom-built bass traps that are bound to work differently than this. So I wouldn't take that conclusion to the bank that the AVAAs work in a different realm than passive traps, but it might be something that those of you who are on almost any kind of a budget would have to take into consideration. And anyone with experience in acoustics will tell you that there are a lot of variables at work. Every room is different. Every setup is different, so it's hard to be perfectly predictive. Given how hard controlling room resonances below 100 Hz is, I also checked just the passive bass trap arrangement against nothing. That means no bass treatment. My rough conclusion is that I would need at least 8 passive traps to do approximately what the 2 AVAAs do. The passive traps would cost somewhat less, maybe half of what 2 AVAAs would cost. But of course, they would be substantially larger. To put numbers on this, the volume of 2 AVAAs is about 4 cubic feet, while the volume of 8 passive traps is about 32 cubic feet. In a larger dedicated room, that might be fine, but I can imagine smaller rooms, say under 2,000 cubic feet, or 3,500 cubic foot listening rooms where passive bass traps would just be a non-starter. It's also possible to mix passive and active traps if you really want to tackle tough problems. So you could get started with passive traps and then add the AVAAs, or you could use the AVAAs, and if you didn't find that to be sufficient, you could either get more or you could add a few passive traps. That's an approach to solving tough bass problems, and I have to say, I think essentially every audiophile who hasn't gone down the bass trapping route faces tough bass modal problems, and even some who have gone down that route simply haven't gone far enough to really successfully address the problem. As a final note, the impact of the AVAAs can be turned up or down somewhat. There's 1 setting for more absorption than I used, and 2 settings for less absorption. The drivers and amps don't have unlimited headroom. There are warnings to tell you if you're overdoing it. But it's possible that in smaller rooms, a single AVAA would be sufficient. I thought the AVAAs were impressively helpful. They are super easy to set up, very easy to hide, and probably do more than realistic numbers of passive treatments, albeit at a higher cost. The big thing is that the bass sound quality with the AVAAs was noticeably improved in a way that may not be practical with any other technology. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please click on the subscribe button. Please hit the notification bell. That way you can find out when we post additional videos, which we're doing every week. We would also invite you to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. There's a URL in the show notes that you can use to subscribe. It's free. We, of course, would also invite you to become a subscriber to the Absolute Sound magazine. It only is the cost of a cup of coffee every 6 months or so, and we've been publishing it for 50 years, and we think we've got some of the finest audio reviews anywhere in the magazine. So we hope you'll join us. We hope you'll come back to watch more videos, and we thank you for watching this one.